Hello, everybody. Welcome to Close of Business Tuesday. By the time you're watching it, it's Open of Business Wednesday, so you know what happened at the debate. To celebrate the American tradition of presidential debates, we found some Case Western Reserve University t-shirts. You too can have one of these on your local Amazon site. But we're in the spirit here, and we want to talk about energy, policy, and politics. So, yep, we're going right into the danger zone, folks. We've got Bob McNally and Glenn Schwartz from Rapidan. They'll tell you a little bit more about the firm, but these guys, Bob's been doing it for over 30 years in Washington. He's an internationally recognized voice in energy. Glenn has spent a lot of time in clean energy with a legal background, and so he's got a lot to add. And these guys, again, they're trying to tell us what could happen. Not necessarily what anybody wants to happen. We're excited. We thought we would add to this discussion Pennsylvania because we're not political scientists, but it seems like the biggest oil and gas swing state. And Charlie Giroux is joining us. Charlie is a nationally recognized advisor to business and governments. And through the Friend Network, we were able to find Charlie. So welcome, Charlie. Welcome, Bob. Welcome, Glenn.
We're all over the place politically. We have left, we have right, we have center, but we all try to check our bias and predict things correctly, at least ask the right questions objectively. So I think it's the reason climate change has become such an important policy for the Democratic Party. I think it is the rise of the millennial generation. This issue is extremely important for the millennials. The millennials are getting into their 30s now, and they're electing high-profile members of Congress like AOC and others. For them, this is a way to sort of not only address a pressing environmental challenge, which has been widely discussed in their generation and so forth, but it's also a way to re-engage in the world. See, the Democrats are going to say, look, Donald Trump walled us off from the world. And it's okay, China, but we've got to go back and talk to Europe and talk to other countries. We have to engage in a positive way. And I think engaging in the Paris Agreement and re-engaging and cooperating with other countries toward climate change, it's sort of like the one rationale that remains for global cooperation. No one's really thrilled about global trade these days at a popular level. No one's really thrilled about fighting wars, whether it's in a coalition or not. Everyone's sort of sick of that. But the one issue that remains for the left that excites them, particularly in the international arena, I think is climate change. So I think it's a reaction to President Trump's rollback of environmental regulations and easing of environmental regulations and promotion of fossil fuels. So it's a reaction to that. I think those are the reasons that explain why. And finally, I'll just say Bernie Sanders. I mean, Bernie Sanders has been a force in both of these election cycles right now. He came close, especially in 2016. Both times he came close. And nobody can ignore it. Certainly Joe Biden didn't, and the other candidates did not ignore Bernie Sanders and the groups that he represents. And for him, the number one issue, is climate change. So I think for those reasons, you see it ascended. But let me ask my colleague Glenn Schwartz.
Political movements come in waves, and we've seen sort of the Republicans move further to the right on a lot of issues, particularly on the environment. I mean, Nixon signed the Clean Air Act into law, and once upon a time, not in the too distant past, cap and trade was a conservative market-based idea on how to deal with climate change. And we've seen, obviously, that the party, especially with the emergence of the Tea Party in 2010, moved further to the right to, not really acknowledging these, in the left circles, the seriousness in which they feel the issue deserves. And whenever you have a movement one way, you can expect an equal and opposite Newtonian push, or pull in the other direction. And I think you're really getting that sense with the Democrats as well. In that, and moreover, as Bob said, millennials are coming of age, and they're not just hearing more about climate change. They're looking at things like these California wildfires. They're looking at things like these, super hurricanes like Hurricane Sandy. They had to come up with a new name for that. They're hearing things like, I forget exactly what it was called, the Arctic bombs that we were having that were, these are all extreme weather events that, whether or not, I'm not a scientist, I don't know if you can tie them directly, but there are people that are making those connections, and it's more pervasive. I also think part of the appeal is that it's not just a climate issue. It has become an equity issue, an environmental justice issue, where the sense that this is a function of the wealthy that is taking more than they need and destroying sort of the environment, which is why you see when they're talking about passing things in the future, this Green New Deal, it's not cloaked as just a green issue. It's cloaked as a jobs issue, a stimulus issue, an infrastructure issue, all sorts of things, a tax issue, all sorts of things beyond just green and climate change that are all tugging at and pulling at where the energy of the Democratic Party is right now, and that's on the progressive end.
So maybe I could just ask a question on that, because on the question of jobs, it's kind of fascinating. Charlie, you're there in Pennsylvania. You were mentioning to me, unions always play an important role in elections. Unions are obviously thinking about jobs for their people. Could you share some of the on-the-ground sentiment in Pennsylvania around jobs and energy policy, and how does that really, which way does that really cut?
Yeah, let me put it in some context first. I'm sure that you've all heard a lot about what's going on in the suburban rim around Philadelphia, the 4 suburban so-called Cowler counties that have trended over the years, and particularly more recently very dramatically blue, and are going to vote for Joe Biden this time and give the Democrats some hope of reestablishing and rebuilding their blue wall, which 4 years ago was supposed to be the backstop for Hillary Clinton. But what's going on in the other corner of the state, the southwest corner, is dramatically different. There you have traditional Democrat counties and regions where they are not only flipping registration-wise to Republican, but the numbers there for Donald Trump are off the charts. I mean, if you drive down the roads there, I began my career working for Ronald Reagan. If you were for Ronald Reagan, you stuck a sign in your front yard. These people have 32 signs and a banner and a flag and all this and that. It really is incredible to notice the intensity. Last weekend, we had a forum in Washington County, which is on the West Virginia border, the far western side of Pennsylvania. And on stage, we had Nick DeIuliis. Some of you may know Nick. He's the CEO of CNX, 2.25 or 2.3 billion market cap corporation. And seated next to him was the head of the Boilermakers Union. And at the end of the forum, I said, isn't it remarkable that here we have kind of the penultimate notion of corporate America sitting side by side with big labor saying exactly the same thing. And I probed a little bit with Sean Steffi, the head of the Boilermakers Union, say, I assume you're a lifelong Democrat? Absolutely, never been a Republican. Has your union ever endorsed a Republican candidate? Never. And this year you're all in for Donald J. Trump? All in. And our members are lockstep in that direction. And even the head of the AFL-CIO statewide in an interview this week said, we don't like Donald Trump. We're all in for Joe Biden, but I got to tell you, not all of our members are.
It's fascinating. We'll get more from you, Charlie, on the ground in Pennsylvania as we go here. Bob, do you want to give us some more just top level?
If we think about the most immediate and impactful things, the ways that a Joe Biden president would affect the oil markets and the energy sector, I think we first think about 2 things for next year. If at some point it's clear that Joe Biden won, and the only thing we know is it's probably not going to be on November 3rd or 4th, but if at some point it's clear, I think 2 things become clear. One, the odds of Iran's oil returning to the market next year, probably in the second half of 2021. It's going to take some time to get it done. But Joe Biden's made it very clear he will make a beeline for the JCPOA, the nuclear deal. He wrote a CNN op-ed about it. He's not writing a lot of op-eds in this campaign. The one he wrote that's most recent is, I'm going back into the nuclear deal. So think about 1.8 million barrels a day or thereabouts of Iranian crude coming back next year, okay? And a related thing, the second thing is, I think one of the most overlooked and important changes that has benefited the oil and gas sector in the United States is Donald Trump's metamorphosis on OPEC, or as he understands now, OPEC plus. Okay, Donald Trump, if you look at his readings, writings, and history, second only to the Chinese, sometimes often more so than the Chinese, Donald Trump could not stand OPEC, couldn't stand them. Not only has he become a fan of swing production and OPEC, now OPEC plus, as we saw in April, he's banging deals together. The United States practically joined OPEC plus in the leadership circle with Saudi Arabia and Russia. And so let's imagine we get to the end of the year. You guys are watching demand, we're watching demand. Let's say the market's a little soft, maybe some more cutting has to be done. Things get a little wobbly and shaky. If Joe Biden is, I don't think Joe Biden wants to kill shale, to be honest. But is he going to call up MBS and Putin and say, get a deal done, the whole relationship's on the line, you better cut some more, I don't want to see 30 or 40 or negative 40 price again? No, he will not. He will not. And without that supervision, again, I think Russia and Saudi Arabia have their own reasons for collaborating. They don't want to go back to the second quarter. They don't want to see that again. However, always helps to have an interested party like the United States driving a deal. That goes away with Donald Trump gone. So from the perspective of a hurting and a wounded shale sector, looking at next year in a soggy market recovering from COVID, the last thing I want is to think that floor, that $40 or $35 floor could be gone, and that we have to deal with another 1.8 million barrels a day of, from Saudi perspective, especially unfriendly crude returning to the market. So it starts there, and that's the big impact. And then if you go out a few years, then you get the implications of Joe Biden using his administrative powers, and I'll defer to Glenn to walk through the top ones. His administrative powers, stroke of the pen, reversing a lot of Trump rollbacks and rules, starting his new rules, requiring the greenhouse gases be taken more into account in all federal permitting, banning new leasing on federal lands. And I get it, there's not a lot of acreage right now, but that'll bite a little ways down the road if the market cleans up. He will make appointments to FERC and other places that could all but, again, hardwire greenhouse gas permitting into greenhouse gases into permitting decisions. Then we have an angry Democratic Senate right now, and we think if Biden wins, the Senate probably goes Democratic. And if you have that, we think there's a very good chance they will get rid of the filibuster, the rule that says you need 60 votes in the Senate for most legislation. That probably goes away, at least for energy and climate change. Joe Biden may give the Republicans a few months to play ball. If they don't play ball, and we don't think they will, I think they will get rid of that filibuster and start enacting legislation. And by enacting legislation, you can not only get that spending done that he wants, but you can do things like end the exemption that hydraulic fracturing enjoys under the Safe Drinking Water Act. If I think there's one sleeper issue, if you ask me, say, what of all the issues, everything you're being asked about, everything you're looking at, what's the one thing that nobody is talking about now that could be something we're all talking about by the middle of next year? And I think it's so-called Halliburton loophole, this exemption from the Safe Drinking Water Act that was put into place for hydraulic fracturing. We're not talking about produced water and flowback water. That's regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act. I'm talking about frac job, every single frac job requiring a underground injection control permit program or frac fluid recipes from EPA and so forth. That is, I think, almost could be a showstopper if you add that regulatory burden on top of the industry where it is. So all of those things start grinding in, Maynard. And I think, we've modeled it. I'm sure you guys have looked at it. We think, looking, say, 3 years out, the difference between Biden and Trump is about 1 million barrels a day of production in lower 48 crude in the United States. Those suite of policies, which are all aimed at one thing, raise the cost of capital for the industry, make it harder to get work done, to get projects financed, to get infrastructure permitted. When we're in a glut, not so much of a problem. Down the road, though, when things pick up and we need that oil, it'll bite more. And we think there's about 1 million barrel a day spread between what production would be under Trump in 2023, say, and Biden.
Bob, just a follow-up question to that. So you've talked about two interesting dynamics. First and foremost, a potential policy change, which would add quite a bit of risk to barrels coming back to the market from Iran, and then potentially incremental regulation that could make it very hard for the U.S. to respond with supply. As you look at those two dynamics and you think out 2-3 years down the road, as you've kind of modeled this out, what is the likely pricing response? If the U.S. isn't actually able to swing capacity and you depress prices in the interim, does that policy ultimately backfire and we ultimately see significantly higher oil and gas prices as we move out a couple of years?
The answer, I think, is absolutely yes, but I think we need to go out beyond a couple of years. We are in such a glut here. And with all the uncertainties with COVID, it's going to take a while to work off. And we don't have demand getting back, to pre-COVID levels until the end of 2022, like on a quarterly basis at the earliest. So I think we have to give it a couple more years than just a couple of years. So maybe 4 or 5 years. But absolutely, if you step back, in my view, the federal government and state governments will be much more successful at slowing investment in the supply side than they will curtailing demand. You see that around the world. Subsidies for electric vehicles and other things are being reduced, even by countries which are announcing car bans, ICE car bans. And so also, when you try to interfere with a consumer's purchase of something, you lose your head or you lose an election, and that's unpleasant for a politician. So what's much more politically safe and impactful will be what we talked about. Indirect regulations the public never sees. The costs are borne by industry and passed along and embedded in other things. So I think the regulation will be successful at slowing investment. It will not curtail demand. And by the time we get to the middle of the decade or longer, we're going to find out the next big surprise in global oil markets is that demand is a lot stronger than everyone else thought. We may have trouble getting back up to pre-COVID levels because of COVID and the big ditch we're going to get out of. But I think we're going to come roaring out. And I think while we are in an energy transition, and I think electric vehicles will continue to grow, I don't think they're going to grow as fast as the consensus expects. And so by the middle of this decade, we're going to find out we are in a thirstier world and we're short supply. And as you said, it's not so much just that the US won't be there, but we'll start to use up the excess spare capacity in Saudi Arabia and Russia. And that's when the party really gets started, to use Maynard's words. And we will be, I think, well into the triple digits by the end of the decade. In other words, I think we're sowing the seeds for even a bigger price boom later in the decade that the survivors of this sweating will enjoy.
Charlie and Lynn, I want to get you guys back in. I think, Charlie, for those of us who aren't in Pennsylvania, a lot of our viewers are, but how is the frack ban, is that the thing that people focus in on, or what are the questions people are really asking energy-wise of these two candidates? I assume it's the frack ban, but talk to us about the landscape some more there.
Yeah, there's no question that the ban on fracking is a talking point in much of Pennsylvania. And, Biden has been trying to walk back some of the comments that he made earlier. I heard one of your speakers say he won't support a ban on fracking, but clearly Kamala Harris has said that she would. And, there's a question in some folks' minds about the balance of influence, shall we say, on that ticket. But there are a couple of other issues. And by the way, just so that the folks that are watching this are aware, the official position of the Democrat Party in Pennsylvania is for a ban on fracking. They passed a resolution, in fairness, over the objection of both former Governor Rendell and the former chairman of the Democrat National Committee and the head of the AFL-CIO in Pennsylvania. But they passed a moratorium resolution several years ago, and that remains their position. But there are a couple of other issues that come to bear in all of this. One is pipeline development, and there's no question about that being a major issue for the Pennsylvania workforce and the economy, as well as facilities like this cracker plant that we now have in Beaver County, which is ready to come online, has had 6,000 construction jobs, $40 billion worth of investment surrounding it, and really promises to be a tremendous boon to the state's economy. But one other thing that I would mention is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is a major point of contention at the state level in Pennsylvania. And I believe that a Biden election would impact that, because I think the governor would feel empowered to move forward in his support of that. And the legislature might believe that they're got less juice, as it were, to oppose the impact and the joining of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So I think there are a variety of issues surrounding natural gas in Pennsylvania. A lot of them drive right down to consumers.
What about, Charlie, just natural gas? I think one of the things we Bob was mentioning it, is the way natural gas has swung out of favor with some people at the same time that natural gas has, helped the U.S. lower its CO2 emissions. Like, just how about just gas? You see it. New York State doesn't want fracked gas coming across, even just coming across the state. I mean, what are the attitudes around natural gas, and how does that determine how you vote?
That's a great question. I think it's much more specific in our state to the applications of natural gas. For example, pipeline development in the southeastern part of the state is very unpopular, but that's the lifeblood of natural gas, both to export markets and to New England, which has Russian gas coming into Boston Harbor as a result of our inability to get ours there. Pennsylvania, having moved to the number 2 position nationally of natural gas development, has a lot of issues like that I think are, bubbling beneath the surface of this campaign. But I will tell you that for folks, in my judgment, that are concerned about the development, safe and responsible, of natural gas in the future and the ability to transport it to markets, there's a large plurality there that's going to swing towards President Trump. And in a state that he carried by only 44,000 votes 4 years ago, could potentially be the difference in 2020.
I was just going to say, one reason why I asked, I happened to see the letter the EPA wrote California, where they said, like, you guys can't ban ICE vehicles. You're just, it was very combative.
Yeah.
And obviously, I don't think we're going to see something like that out of a Biden EPA. So it seems like it might encourage states to go their own way if you get a Biden administration, particularly if they're going in a certain way. But
so if you look at California specifically, and everybody does because they're the vanguard of the climate movement when it comes to this kind of stuff, the EV stuff in particular, I think, was not well appreciated of what was actually in it. It wasn't an edict that's going to say, well, here's your fine for operating an ICE vehicle, see you later, we're impounding your vehicle. What it was, if you look at the language of the executive order itself, was really a command to the California Air Resources Board to really redo their ZEV program and just extend it in a new way, and a new target, and it's a more aggressive target, absolutely. But it's just another regulatory mechanism that, once you realize that, it just, the impact that at least we think it's going to have is much less significant. I mean, if you look at several things, we're looking at here. First, number one, California's history with ZEV mandates. Since 1990, they've set their targets, realized they weren't going to hit it, reversed near-term targets, and then extended more aggressive out-term targets 8 different times since 1990. 8 times. So, they're not great at actually hitting the targets once they set them. I actually think the current 22% by 2025 they are going to hit. But that brings us to the second point, which is that these ZEV programs, they're really just not as stringent as advertised. And there is a world of difference between being in compliance and actually adding zero-emission vehicles on the road and taking barrels off the market. And that's just a function of how this thing is organized. You're not, while it's turned in sort of, getting cars on the road, they're submitting credits. And there's a number of ways that, if you look and really dig down on the regulation, there are voluminous ways to meet these requirements without actually putting the cars on the road. You have things like credit multipliers, extra credits depending on how good a battery is and what the range is, banking and trading. Tesla doesn't have an obligation because they don't have any ICE vehicles. So all the credits that they create, they send out into the ether. And because of this, I mean, since like 2015, they had enough credits without increasing the EV penetration a single percentage point to comply through the end of next year. And that's so it's just not as significant. Now circling back to your question here, will that regulation even happen? That letter from the EPA was based on the fact that the Trump administration passed a rule, the SAFE Act, that eliminated California's waiver to put together its own regulations, including the ZEV mandate. That is currently being litigated. If you had asked me 3 weeks ago, what are my odds it survives court review through SCOTUS, I would have said not that great. But with Justice Ginsburg's passing and her likely replacement, I think there probably are votes. They say a good lawyer knows the law, a great lawyer knows the judges. The case where the judges are going to make a big difference here. But all that said, if Biden wins, he can take it off SCOTUS's docket by saying, don't worry, guys, I'm going to remand this and take another look at it. And we saw that across the board when Trump took over in 2017, where any sort of rules that were in litigation, he could sort of just remove by saying, don't worry, my administration's taking another look. And we think Biden would absolutely allow and encourage states to go forward with the ZEV program and in particular, because they are the leaders in that respect.
Let me pick up that point, Glenn, and maybe direct this to Bob. It is, I think for those of us who don't live and breathe Washington politics, somewhat amusing when politicians say, you actually listened to me and you're going to actually make a decision based off of what I said. Or, you're litigating or regulating through regulations and you're worried about that. We live in the land of people who actually have to, put capital to work, actually have to take risks. And when they hear something like that, particularly in the context of what just happened with the Dakota Access Pipeline, what was that, 6 weeks ago? They don't view it in such a sublime way and in such a, it's just, us being politicians. They say, I'm going to get killed. I'm going to lose my capital. I'm going to lose my jobs. I'm going to lose my permit, including my social permit to operate. So this question is for you, Bob, because I know we talked about it last week. We have the Supreme Court nomination. And Glenn, you did just touch on this, but Bob, I'd be interested in your thoughts on, let's say that the president's nominee is confirmed before the election. Let's say Mr. Biden wins the election. What happens if we do start to see that the counter response to legislating through the courts for things like Dakota Pipeline is met with a person with a job for life deciding to throw around some weight and saying, okay, I can do that too?
That is a great question. Well, let me think of it this way, though. When it comes to DAPL, Dakota Access Pipeline, and other pipelines, where the developers have been stymied by the courts. And here I'm just channeling what I've learned from my legal instructor, Glenn Schwartz. But the real problem there, in a way, was the Trump administration, and President Trump admitted this in a public comment. He's like, we didn't cross the T's and dot the I's. There's been a certain lack of diligence and preparedness in sort of going to the courts and saying, look, we're going to check the box that you want us to check for climate change and other things. It's not a high hurdle. You don't have to do a lot. But the administration has taken sort of I'm going to wash my hands of it. I don't even care. And so the courts have been stopping these pipelines and they've been imposing defeats on industry, not because they say, no, we're cooking the earth and we must not have this. No, they've been saying your homework isn't complete. You didn't put the date in and number it, and you didn't answer questions 4 and 7. So go home. And so it's these types of things. And so I have to say, and that's Roberts, the swing vote on the court now, is a stickler for procedure. And it's not clear, if the new justice is sworn in, if she's nominated and confirmed, and she is nominated, confirmed, and we have a 6-3 conservative court, I'm not 100% convinced that at the pipeline sort of permitting level, things will get better at those lower courts, at least anytime soon, unless the administration does a better job at its homework in some ways. And that's, I get no huge friends by saying that, but I think that's the case now. But the big but. Underlying a 6-3 court could do 2 important things. One is it could get rid of what they call Chevron deference, right? And that's the idea since the 80s, the courts enshrined, which said, look, if an agency made a decision on a permitting and it seems reasonable, the deference goes to the agency. So it creates a high hurdle for reversing an agency decision. So this Chevron deference means EPA wins or BLM wins. And if it's Obama EPA or a Biden EPA, that means you lose. Okay. But by getting rid of Chevron deference, you would create more, you give more leverage to the industry in their court battles. Secondly, if you want to think of sort of the taproot of all clean air regulation that is in place that matters most for industry and is coming outside the Safe Drinking Water Act, it's under the Clean Air Act. And that Massachusetts decision in 2007 that said, yep, EPA has got to consider greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. We don't think this court, a 6-3 textualist conservative court, will completely reverse that, although you cannot rule that out. But that would be seismic. But we think it'll chip it away. It'll say, yeah, maybe for cars, tailpipes, but not for power or something like that. And that is going to undermine the bedrock, again, foundation of environmental regulation, which is one more reason, sorry to tie it back to legislation, one more reason why the Democrats are likely to say, in the face of a 6-3 court, before talking about packing it with 2 new senators, forget about that. They're going to say, this is nuts. We're here to fight climate change. We're getting stopped by these conservatives, some of whom they believe were put in illegitimately. We're going to pass legislation and just hardwire what we do and get it done faster. And if necessary, we'll overturn the norm of a filibuster. So those are the implications, I think, of the court changes on the election and environmental policy going forward.
I would just add in, I think you know, the intransigence to some degree is because, I mean, if I'm president or I'm regulating here, an intelligent decision on what to regulate and how is a cost-benefit analysis in my mind. If the costs or if the benefits exceed the costs, this is a good move. If the benefits don't exceed the costs, this is a bad move. The problem is that there is no agreement on the costs or the benefits. If one side believes climate change is not real, therefore there is no benefit to fighting climate change in any regulation. If there's no benefit, any cost is too high. It's a bad policy. If the other side believes that the planet's about to bake itself, I mean, that's the highest benefit there could possibly be. So almost any cost is justified. It's just gotten so extreme here.
Well, I'll respond to just that point. I think there's a danger sometimes in portraying that there's only two sides. When I hear that, that's just not true. And so you got to be really careful when you see in the press this need to like stir the pot and say this side's against that side. I often say, where are the editors? You know, I remember doing a tour of the New York Times when I was in college, you know, the building in New York City, and just being flabbergasted at how precise these people were and like how meticulous. I thought, God, I am a type A person. These people like take it to a whole new level. So, you know, I think that part of the danger is the medium it's so easy to just send something into the ether, and the viral aspect of it is get people furiously believing that somehow it's yes, no, binary 1, 0. And I think often the issue is people may agree on science, they disagree on policy. And they, you know, reasonable people can be like for nuclear and against nuclear. It doesn't mean one's the right answer. And that's the problem, because one team says, I am 100% right and you are 100% wrong. And so I would just caution all of us, if you start finding yourself thinking that way during this debate or in any debate, you already are fighting yourself, because that just can't be right. I want to just go back and maybe ask a very specific question. I think some of the people in the oil patch are nervous that if we did have 2.3 million barrels per day of crude come back from Iran and go into markets, that much as we can all have, you know, kind of our expectations of what will happen, get displaced like it was with COVID, you know, all the best laid plans suddenly didn't matter anymore. What happens if in February we do see the Iran deal back in place? 2.3, 2.4 million barrels per day are now sloshing in markets. Jet fuel demand, which is currently at 62% of normal, is impaired or maybe even going the other way. And now you suddenly have a market where oil prices collapse globally. We were talking before the show, Disney announced today that 28,000 workers have lost their jobs. I mean, we are hanging on by a thread. And the last thing we need is to have some of the great industries of the world, you know, have this surprise suddenly hit Pennsylvania, hit Texas, hit Oklahoma. But if he does in February and 2.4 million barrels per day get back into markets, we are not going to be talking about California's EV plan. We're going to be talking about the $3 oil price and all the jobs that just got obliterated, and being back in, the double dip recession and the Great Recession of 2021, which will look just like 1982. And people, at the Harvard Business Review will write stories about it for the next 15 years. Right. And everybody will be like, why did you do that?
Yeah. Well, here's where I think having someone more pragmatic like Joe Biden matters, where a Bernie Sanders would not. So we don't think by any chance, we'll start negotiations in February, but they'll barely have people with their fobs to get in their office. Having been through a transition, nothing will happen until the June, I think. I think the feelers will go out and this and that, but we assume, and this is a rapid scenario, people say we're too fast. The second half of the year, we're back in the nuclear deal. So I would just push back a little bit about February, but whether it's February or March or June, whatever it is, I think the discussion is going to go like this if it's President Biden. He's going to say, I want back in the JCPOA, tweak it a little better. And they're going to say, but sir, if we have another 2.3, you say 1.8 of exports returning, total 2.3 back in the market, and we got Libya back, and this is kind of good news, except that the market's going to collapse. And, I think he will actually care in a way. Bernie Sanders would be like, and why is that not a feature and instead of a bug? I like that. Sounds like a co-benefit of the policy you're telling me. We're going to hurt shale even more. Biden won't do that, nor will his advisors, I think, on foreign policy. So they will say quietly, not like Trump did it, quietly, call MBS, call Putin. And I wouldn't be surprised, as you saw, President Obama did this, and President Clinton, Secretary Richards, you can remember, going to OPEC means calling the Saudi oil minister out of meetings during 98, 99 when oil was going to $10. So he was, I think you'll see some soft messaging to the Saudis and the Russians. Let's not let this thing get out of hand, because it's more than just the oil patch. It's financial stability. It's economic stability. It's the banking system. If we go back to, depending on whether we have to go to negative prices again, but if we start seeing, single-digit oil prices, it's a lot more than shale, or lot more than the oil patch that hurts then. So I think you'll see this pressure to say, please. Now the question then becomes, is that enough? And will they do so? Saudi Arabia will have some asks. They will not be happy about Iran going back in that nuclear deal. They will not be happy about the vitriol that will be coming their way from the whole Democratic Party establishment toward the Saudis. The Saudi-U.S. relationship is probably the biggest thing that turns, other than the Paris Agreement, if Biden's elected on foreign policy. And that has energy implications too. So I do think you will see something that's an echo of, let's call it, conventional democratic governance at the foreign policy. They will not want instability in oil prices, and they'll realize, to your point, if Russia and Saudi don't agree to put more cuts through, that's exactly what you'll get. And I think he'll have advisors. Knowing his advisors, they may not, whether or not they have formal positions, but I think he'll take advice, and he'll have memory from 2016 and 2015 and so forth, and he'll want to work that. So I think there'll be some behind-the-scenes negotiating. Let me put it that way.
So would you guys, the three of you, you've seen a lot of elections, you've seen a lot of energy policies and debates. Does this rank as perhaps the most important election for energy policy that you recall seeing? Is it that significant? Sometimes it seems that way, but then we always talk ourselves into that. What do you guys think?
No question. If you look at the past instances of where energy policy was topmost in our policy making, and we undertook sweeping policies, domestic and international, you do have to go back to the 1970s and the 1970s for the Nixon and then the Carter administration. But energy, it wasn't really so much a campaign issue back then. It wasn't like we were debating climate change or how much to do for allocate for renewables versus domestic. Even Jimmy Carter was doing domestic, renewables, everything. It was kind of all of the above. And so I think this is the one election, given the increased polarization, given what Glenn said is so important, which explains the vitriol. Climate change, this environmental issue, is now about justice, foreign policy, socialism, economic activity, employment, infrastructure. It's the whole ball of wax. And I think that we are having an election in a way almost outside of an emergency, but yet these issues are so front and center. They may not be in the debate tonight, which you'll be seeing tomorrow morning. I don't know if it's going to come up tonight, but it is very much on the agenda. And I think that is unusual. We haven't seen that, I would say, almost in modern times, if ever, that the stakes for energy policy weren't so high with this election in the absence of an emergency, if you will.
I think that the stakes are exceptionally high, and I agree that they're pervasive. It's not just energy policy per se, but it runs through social policy, economic policy, and it impacts on issues from capital formation to regulatory policy to a lot of the little specifics that we've talked about. And with respect, I have to tell you, I think your view of a President Biden is a very optimistic one. I'm not sure I share all of the optimism that he truly is a centrist of some sort. I mean, ordinarily, when candidates have captured their party's nomination, they move aggressively and clearly and obviously towards the center. And Biden did not do that. He went and he formed the unity plan with Bernie Sanders, run by AOC and John Kerry. I mean, that to me doesn't look like somebody who's necessarily going to govern as a centrist.
Glenn, let me let you throw something in here. The way Bob introduced you is you periodically at Rapidan speak not for the left, but for the other side of the aisle. What would you tell us about all this?
Well, I love to consider myself a devil's advocate here, and just based on the dynamic that we have in the office, that look frequently has me coming at it from the left. But yeah, no, there's no question. I don't think anyone would disagree the stakes are high here. I mean, again, if you're coming at it from the left, climate change for a lot of them, for progressives in particular, is an existential issue, and it's not just an existential issue. It's an economy-defining issue as far as jobs, environmental justice. It's a racism issue as well. It deals with infrastructure. It deals with the way we live. It touches every aspect of life. And you're absolutely correct earlier when you said, look, there aren't just two sides to this. But President Trump has made pretty clear what he thinks about climate change, and that's that it's not a thing that bothers him. If he consents that it is real and happening, it's not something he's concerned about. And if that's where you start your policy from, Joe Biden, who is going to consider climate change a very real threat and make policy as a result, is going to be wildly different. I actually think, he is a centrist, but a centrist of the Democratic Party, meaning that I would call him a pathological centrist, actually, where he'll look to see where the Democratic Party has moved, find the new center, and plant himself there. The center of the Democratic Party has moved quite a bit. We've done analysis of shows where Biden has moved just in the last year. He hasn't been shoved all the way into the Green New Deal sort of, he hasn't considered banning exports, even though he would have the authority to do so if he declares an emergency. He hasn't even said he'd declare an emergency, despite there being a lot of push for that kind of thing, where you can utilize just the enormous Pandora's box treasure trove of rules and authorities they'd have under IEPA. So, he's looking forward to what can get him elected. But he's also looking forward to, trying to walk a line between what you see on the progressive left and what's going to be in the right. I mean, a good point. He supported a carbon price, but not in any of his printed material. I mean, he gets very careful in what he puts out in his plans. He mentions polluters paying for the cost of their pollution, but the idea of actually writing the words carbon tax, not in there. In a lot of ways, we think he could lead from behind on issues like that. He's not going to get in the way. Certainly, he would sign something like that if it came to his desk, but is he going to push it? He's very aware of the political consequences last time someone has tried to put a tax on that. I would push back on how far he is. He's certainly further to the left than any Democratic president we've seen, even considering Obama and Hillary's platform. But the idea that it's going to be the progressive left calling the shots on here, it doesn't read to me. Not just because of the limitations of what a president can do on his own, which are significant, but the fact that if you look at legislation, the legislative kingmakers here are going to be the group of 8 to 10 to 12 moderate Democrats, assuming they take the chamber, from purplish states that are going to decide and moderate anything that comes out of the House. A carbon price of $50 is not going to pass. Let's talk $15. Stuff like that.
I'm also reminded, though, that we have absolutely no skill to forecast 5 years in the future. And I remember in the 80s, one of the most popular songs was from Sting about the Russians. And there were all these movies about nuclear war. And this was an existential threat, too. And by 1991, 1992, the USSR was gone. And now, the Francis Fukuyamas of the world are writing the end of history. And, it was like, wait, what just happened to my existential millenarianism, end of world stuff? And we do this over and over again. I'm sure in 1896, the debate about the gold standard would have been astonished that in 1913, the Federal Reserve got created. So, one caution I have is I think we all get caught up in the moment of like, this is the most important thing in the history of the world. But that is just the narcissism of human beings. It's always the most important thing in the history of the world. And what I would love to have a crystal ball on is like 5 or 6 years from now, when that other thing comes down the pike and there's some just ridiculously smart engineer or artist or person in society, and we just go whoop in that direction. And, they listen and they hear about us characterizing any particular election, and they have different views about it. And I'm not saying that this isn't an important election or these aren't important issues. Just the history of the world is we are awful at forecasting even a few years into the future. And when you see this kind of vibration and tension in American society in particular, it tends to be a call to like the radical middle to say, this is so important. Would somebody please come here and pay attention to this and fix it in the right way that we do? And you do get some solutions. So at least that's my hopeful, optimistic, in the middle kind of perspective, because obviously everybody makes good points. These are all totally legitimate issues and complaints.
Yeah, I would add to. I think you're right. Certainly, anyone who's predicted the end of the world so far in human history has been wrong.
Good point.
But there are models out there. If you look hard enough, there is collaboration. I would point to Colorado. I know recent history since 2018 is a little bit more extreme. But if you look to the Hickenlooper administration. They were the first in the country to put in methane rules. And how they did that was Hickenlooper said, look, this is the direction I want to go. Industry, you guys are in the room. Environmentalists, you guys are in the room. What can you live with? And they went through and they had a process, and it was a purple state, and they knew that industry was important to jobs in the economy, but they also wanted to move forward. And at the end of the process, they went through a big, long process. At the end, they looked at the environmentalists, and they said, are you unhappy? Yeah. Are you unhappy, industry? Yeah, great. We got a policy we're happy with. And that's what they went forward with.
Well, I don't know how to wrap all that up except to say I knew existential millenarianism would eventually take over the conversation. You guys were great to join us. I know it's some of these issues, they get personal, they get political, and you guys are obviously just trying to analyze it for us all. And for that, we're immensely grateful. You're good friends of the firm. And let's hope, we're wrapping it up here as the debate is going to start in a few hours. These guys may shock us. Charlie, they may talk about issues. They may be cordial. Trump may say he's concerned about global warming. Biden may say, I'm concerned about all these jobs. I mean, these guys could shock us. So we're going to end on that. Thanks so much, everybody. Talk to you soon.